I'm Tracy, 29 female. I live in a modest one-bedroom apartment in the city, where the soundtrack of my life is a mix of distant sirens and the hum of traffic, a world away from the silent, towering pines of my childhood. For the past 7 years, I've worked as an architectural drafter, finding a quiet satisfaction in turning abstract concepts into precise, tangible blueprints. It's a life I built from scratch, piece by piece, after my old one was demolished. This story is about how the family who threw me away tried to crawl back into my life to claim an inheritance they never deserved, and how my grandmother, even after she was gone, gave me the blueprint for the ultimate revenge. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The call came on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were my day for meticulous, mind-numbing work, cross-referencing building codes, refining HVAC layouts, and ensuring every line on my screen was perfect to the millimeter. The focus it demanded was a shield, a way to keep the past where it belonged, out of sight and out of mind. My phone buzzed, vibrating against the smooth surface of my drafting table. I glanced at the screen, expecting a call from a contractor or my project manager. Instead, I saw a number with an area code I hadn't dialed in a decade, the area code for home. My breath hitched. For a moment, I was 19 again, standing on the marble-floored porch of my parents' opulent house, a single duffel bag at my feet. The memory was so vivid I could almost feel the cold autumn air on my cheeks and the sting of my mother's words. "You've made your choice. Don't expect us to support this foolish rebellion." My foolish rebellion was choosing to study architectural drafting, a practical, hands-on career, instead of the corporate law degree they had pre-selected for me. It was about wanting to create things with my hands, not argue in a boardroom. To them, it was a betrayal of the Vance name, a legacy built on venture capitalism and high society interior design. They saw my passion as a blue-collar hobby, an embarrassment, so they cut me off, completely. My grandmother, Clara, had been my only ally. While my parents, Harrison and Alina, saw life as a series of strategic acquisitions, Grandma Clara saw it as a garden to be tended with love and patience. She was the one who taught me to see the beauty in structure, in the way the beams of her mountain lodge held up the roof against the heavy snow. She'd sneak me books on architecture and praise my childhood drawings of fantastical treehouses. When my parents disowned me, she was the one who sent me a check for your first month's rent and a good set of drafting pencils. The note read, tucked inside a worn copy of a book about Frank Lloyd Wright. It was the last contact I'd had with anyone from that life. Tried to stay in touch, but my parents intercepted her letters and calls, making it clear that any connection with me would have consequences for her, too. Eventually, the line went silent. Now, 10 years later, that line was ringing. My finger hovered over the decline button. What could they possibly want? An apology? Unlikely. A reconciliation? Impossible. Curiosity, that traitorous emotion, got the better of me. I swiped to answer, my voice tight. "Hello." A man's voice, professional and unfamiliar, responded. "Am I speaking with Ms. Tracy Vance?" "This is she," I said, my guard immediately up. "Ms. Vance, my name is David Chen. I am the estate lawyer for the late Clara Vance. I'm afraid I have some sad news. Your grandmother passed away peacefully 2 days ago." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. A wave of cold grief washed over me, so potent it left me dizzy. Clara was gone. The one person in that family who had ever truly seen me, who had loved me for who I was gone. I sank into my office chair, the blueprints on my screen blurring into a meaningless grid. I hadn't seen her in 10 years, but the hope of seeing her again, of showing her the life I'd built, had always been a quiet ember in my heart. Now, it was extinguished. I see," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "Thank you for letting me know." "Of course," Mr. Chen said, his tone gentle. "I am very sorry for your loss. The reason I am calling is that your grandmother made very specific arrangements. She has named you in her will. The reading is scheduled for this Friday at 10 a.m. at my office here in Northwood." Northwood? The town nestled at the foot of the mountains where my parents lived, where my grandmother's lodge stood sentinel over the valley. The thought of going back there made my stomach churn. "I'm not sure I can," I said reflexively. "I understand it's difficult," he replied. "However, your grandmother was most insistent. She stipulated that your presence is mandatory for the will to be read as she intended. She left a personal letter for you as well, which I am to give you at the reading." A letter, her final words to me, that was the hook. My parents could be there, the whole town could be there, but I had to know what she wanted to say. It was a final connection, a thread I couldn't leave dangling. The grief in my chest was now mingled with a new feeling, a deep, aching need for closure. "Okay," I said, my voice firmer now. "I'll be there. Can you please provide me with the address?" He gave me the details, and we ended the call. I sat in silence for a long time, the hum of my computer the only sound. My boss found me an hour later, staring at the same blueprint, not a single line changed. He saw the look on my face and simply said, "Take the rest of the week off. Whatever it is, we'll manage." I was grateful for his kindness, a stark contrast to the conditional, transactional affection I grew up with. The next 2 days were a blur of logistics and dread. I booked a room at a small inn on the outskirts of Northwood, unwilling to even entertain the thought of staying anywhere near my parents. I packed a simple, professional black dress, armor for the ordeal ahead. The drive up was 4 hours of winding roads that took me further from my new life and deeper into my old one. With every mile, the concrete and steel of the city gave way to rolling hills, and then to the imposing, jagged peaks of the mountains. They were just as beautiful as I remembered, but the sight no longer brought me peace. It only reminded me of what I had lost. First my family, and now my grandmother. As I pulled into Northwood, the town looked like it was trapped in amber. The same quaint storefronts, the same town square with its oak tree centerpiece. It was a perfect picture of idyllic small-town life, but for me, it was a gilded cage I had fought tooth and nail to escape. My heart pounded in my chest as I drove past the turnoff for my parents' sprawling modern mansion, a monument to their obsession with appearances. My destination was David Chen's office, a discreet brick building on Main Street. I arrived 15 minutes early, needing time to compose myself. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, and took a deep breath. "You are not that 19-year-old girl anymore," I told myself. "You are a 29-year-old woman. You have a career. You have a life. You are here for Grandma Clara, and that's it." Repeating the mantra, I finally found the strength to get out of the car, smooth down my dress, and walk towards the polished oak door of the law office, ready to face the ghosts of my past. I just had no idea they would be waiting for me with smiles and open arms. The reception area of Chen and Associates was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town law firm handling old money. Understated, elegant, and quiet. Polished mahogany furniture, leather-bound books that looked like they'd never been opened, and the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. A polite receptionist led me to a conference room, where the air was already thick with a tension so palpable I could taste it. And there they were. My parents, Harrison and Alina Vance, sat on one side of a long, gleaming table. They looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. My father, Harrison, was in a bespoke suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. At 60, he still had the predatory stillness of a venture capitalist who could gut a company without blinking. My mother, Alina, was the picture of an interior design mogul, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored pantsuit, her jewelry expensive but tasteful. Her face, maintained by what I was sure were the best cosmetic surgeons in the state, was a smooth, unreadable mask. When they saw me, their faces broke into wide, brilliant smiles. It was the most jarring thing I had ever seen. These were the same people who had watched me pack my bags with cold indifference, who hadn't called once in 10 years, not for a birthday, not for a holiday, not even when I'd been hospitalized with pneumonia in my 3rd year of college. A fact I knew they were aware of because I'd listed them as emergency contacts, a mistake I quickly rectified. "Tracy, darling," Alina exclaimed, rising from her chair and gliding towards me. She wrapped her arms around me in a stiff, air-kiss embrace that smelled faintly of Chanel No. 5 and betrayal. "Look at you. You look well." The way she said "well" was layered with meaning, as if she were surprised I hadn't ended up destitute. "Hello, Eleanor, Harrison," I said, my voice flat. I refused to call them Mom and Dad. They hadn't been those things to me for a long time. I gently extricated myself from her grasp. My father stood and gave me a firm, assessing handshake, his eyes scanning me from head to toe. "Good to see you, Tracy," he said, his smile not quite reaching his cold, calculating eyes. "We were so sorry to hear about Clara. A terrible loss. She was a remarkable woman." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They had always treated Grandma Clara as a charming but eccentric relic, a woman who preferred pine trees to profit margins. They tolerated her because of her late husband's old money name, but they'd always been quietly disdainful of her simple, nature-focused life. "We were just saying," Eleanor continued, gesturing for me to take a seat opposite them, "it's a shame it takes a tragedy like this to bring family together." I sat down, placing my hands on the table to keep them from shaking. "Is it?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. Their smiles flickered for a fraction of a second before being plastered back on. They chose to ignore my tone. It was then that Mr. David Chen entered the room, carrying a leather-bound portfolio. He was younger than I expected, with a kind, intelligent face and sharp eyes that seemed to take in the entire family dynamic in a single glance. "Ms. Vance," he said, nodding to me with a small, sympathetic smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance, thank you all for coming. We are here today to read the last will and testament of Clara Ann Vance." He took his seat at the head of the table and opened the portfolio. My parents leaned forward, their masks of geniality slipping just enough to show the avarice underneath. They looked like a pair of well-dressed vultures, ready to pick over a carcass. "Clara was always so sentimental about that old lodge," Harrison said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather. "A beautiful piece of property, of course, prime real estate. The land alone is worth a fortune now." "We were thinking," Eleanor chimed in, turning her brilliant smile on me, "that it would make a wonderful family project. We could turn it into a high-end boutique hotel. A Vance family retreat. It has so much potential with the right investment and a professional redesign. Your father and I have already been running some numbers." I stared at them, my blood turning to ice. They were already planning to carve up my grandmother's home, the one place I had ever felt unconditionally loved, and turn it into another one of their soulless business ventures. The Whisperwind Lodge wasn't just property, it was a sanctuary. Every beam was hand-hewn by my grandfather. Every stone in the giant hearth was pulled from the river that ran through the land. Grandma Clara's life was etched into its very walls. "It would be a way to honor her memory," Eleanor added, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "And a wonderful opportunity for you, Tracy. You could be involved. With your background in drafting, you could certainly contribute in some small way." The condescension was so thick I could have choked on it. Some small way. They saw my entire career, the life I was proud of, as a minor footnote, a hobby they could graciously find a use for in their grand new scheme. I felt a surge of hot anger, but I clamped down on it, remembering why I was there. For Grandma Clara. I needed to hear her final words. I turned my attention to Mr. Chen, giving my parents a look that I hoped conveyed the depth of my disgust. Mr. Chen cleared his throat, seemingly sensing the need to intervene. "If we're all ready," he said, his voice bringing a welcome note of formality to the room, "I will begin." He started with the usual legal boilerplate, confirming Clara's soundness of mind, listing her assets, and acknowledging her various small bequests to local charities. She left a generous donation to the town library and another to the National Park Service to help maintain the mountain trails she loved to walk. Each word was a small testament to the kind, community-minded woman she was. My parents listened with feigned patience, their fingers tapping lightly on the table. This was just the opening act for them. They were waiting for the main event, the disposition of her primary asset, the Whisperwind Lodge, and the 200 acres of pristine mountain land it sat on. And now, Mr. Chen said, pausing and looking over his glasses at each of us in turn, we come to the matter of the Whisperwind Lodge, its surrounding properties, and the remainder of the Vance estate, valued at approximately $5 million. The room fell silent. The only sound was the ticking of the clock. Eleanor's smile tightened, her eyes gleaming. Harrison leaned back in his chair, assuming an air of casual ownership. This was it, the moment they'd been waiting for. They were so certain, so confident that despite their fractured relationship with Clara, the property would naturally fall to them, her only son and his wife. After all, I was the outcast. I was the one who had been written out of the family story. In their minds, I didn't even exist. "Let me read this section verbatim," Mr. Chen said, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he looked down at the document. "As per Mrs. Vance's explicit instructions." Mr. Chen adjusted his spectacles and took a slow, deliberate breath. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint rustle of the paper in his hands. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My parents, on the other hand, looked the very picture of serene confidence. They exchanged a brief, knowing glance, a silent communication that spoke of years of shared ambition and entitlement. They believed this was merely a formality before they could begin drawing up plans for their luxury resort. Regarding my primary residence, known as Whisperwind Lodge, Mr. Chen began to read, his voice clear and steady. Along with the 200 acres of land upon which it sits, all its contents, furnishings, and my personal savings and investment portfolio, I hereby bequeath the entirety of this estate, without encumbrance or condition, to my beloved granddaughter, Tracy Vance. The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched for a full 10 seconds, a void in which my parents' perfect, smiling facades began to crack and crumble. I felt the words wash over me, but they didn't seem real. The entirety of the estate. To me, it was too much to comprehend. A wave of dizziness swept through me as I tried to process the sheer magnitude of it. $5 million, the lodge, everything. My mother was the first to break. A short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor, escaped her lips. That's a mistake, surely," she said, looking at Mr. Chen as if he were a particularly dense employee. "There must be a typo. She must have meant to name Harrison her son." Harrison, for his part, had gone pale. His air of casual command had vanished, replaced by a rigid, stony fury. "Read that again," he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Mr. Chen didn't flinch. He calmly met my father's gaze. "There is no mistake, Mr. Vance. The language is unequivocal. I hereby bequeath the entirety of this estate to my beloved granddaughter, Tracy Vance." "This is absurd," Eleanor burst out, her voice rising in pitch. She shot a venomous glare in my direction. She barely knew the girl. We were the ones here looking after her. The lie was so audacious it almost made me laugh. They hadn't looked after Clara. They had visited her twice a year, on Christmas and her birthday, for carefully timed 90-minute appearances before rushing back to their own world. Their version of care was sending an expensive, impersonal fruit basket from a catalog. "Grandma Clara and I were close," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a slow-burning ember of fierce, protective gratitude. This wasn't just money or property. This was a message. It was my grandmother's final act of love and validation. "Close, you haven't seen her in a decade," Harrison snapped, slamming his hand lightly on the table. "We are her family, her son. This is an insult." "Perhaps," Mr. Chen interjected smoothly, "you should allow me to continue. There is more." He looked down at the will, and my parents fell silent, a sliver of hope apparently rekindling in their eyes. They likely imagined there was a codicil, a clause that would name them as trustees or grant them some measure of control. Mr. Chen cleared his throat. "I leave my granddaughter not just my home, but also a responsibility. It is my deepest wish that Whisperwind Lodge never be sold to developers or turned into a commercial enterprise. It is to remain a sanctuary, a place of peace and nature. To ensure this, I have placed the property and its surrounding land under a conservation easement to be managed by the Northwood Land Trust, effective immediately upon my passing. That was the second blow. A conservation easement meant the land could never be developed. No boutique hotel, no luxury spa, no clearing the forest for scenic condos. My grandmother had, with a single paragraph, utterly demolished their dreams of a Vance family retreat. She had protected her legacy from their greed. Eleanor's face, a carefully constructed mask of youthful serenity, was now twisted in an ugly sneer. A conservation easement. She locked up $5 million of prime real estate. She was clearly not in her right mind when she wrote this. I can assure you, Mrs. Vance, your mother was perfectly lucid, Mr. Chen stated coolly. We updated her just 6 months ago. She was very specific about her intentions. She also had 2 independent physicians verify her mental competence at the time of signing. My grandmother had thought of everything. She had known, with absolute certainty, what my parents would try to do. She had outmaneuvered them from beyond the grave. A slow smile spread across my face. I couldn't help it. For the first time since walking into that room, I felt a sense of power. Not just from the inheritance, but from the knowledge that my grandmother had trusted me, and only me, to be the guardian of the place we both loved. Harrison stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He pointed a trembling finger at me. This is your doing, he seethed. You manipulated her somehow. You poisoned her against her own son. I haven't spoken to her in 10 years, Harrison, I reminded him, my voice steady. You're the one who made sure of that. The truth of my words seemed to infuriate him further. He turned his glare on Mr. Chen. We will contest this. This is a travesty. The will of a senile old woman influenced by an ungrateful child. That is certainly your right, Mr. Chen said, his professionalism unshakable. However, I must advise you that Mrs. Vance's will is ironclad. She anticipated this reaction and took every possible legal precaution. He then reached into his portfolio and pulled out 2 items. One was a thick, sealed manila envelope. The other was an old, ornate brass key on a simple leather cord. He slid them across the table toward me. Your grandmother left these for you, Tracy, he said softly. The key is for the lodge. The envelope contains a personal letter from her. She asked that you read it in private. I picked up the key. It felt heavy and warm in my hand. I remembered it from my childhood, hanging on a hook by the great stone fireplace, the key to everything. I looked at my parents. Their faces were a mixture of shock, rage, and disbelief. Their smiles were gone, shattered into a million pieces, and in their place was the raw, ugly greed that had always lurked just beneath the surface. They had walked in expecting to claim a prize, and instead, they had been handed a public humiliation, a final, definitive rejection from the one person whose love they had always taken for granted. And in that moment, watching their entitlement curdle into fury, I knew my grandmother's gift was more than just a lodge. It was justice. I didn't stay a moment longer than necessary. With a curt nod to Mr. Chen and a complete dismissal of my parents, I took the envelope and the key and walked out of the conference room. I could feel their furious stares boring into my back, but for the first time in my life, their disapproval felt like a badge of honor. I didn't look back. Instead of going back to the inn, I found myself driving up the familiar, winding road that led to Whisperwind Lodge. The city girl in me, the one who had spent a decade building a life surrounded by concrete, felt a primal pull towards the forest. I needed to be there. I needed to be home. The lodge looked exactly as I remembered it, as if time had respectfully held its breath around this sacred place. It was a masterpiece of rustic architecture, built from massive cedar logs and local river stone, nestled perfectly into the mountainside as if it had grown there. A thin plume of smoke curled from the main chimney, and I realized Mr. Chen must have arranged for a caretaker to keep the place maintained. I parked the car and walked to the massive front door, my footsteps silent on the pine needle-strewn path. The brass key felt cool in my trembling hand. It slid into the lock with a familiar, satisfying click. Pushing the heavy door open, I stepped inside, and the scent of cedar, wood smoke, and dried lavender washed over me, a sensory flood of every happy childhood memory I possessed. The great room was just as it was in my mind's eye. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by deep, comfortable armchairs. Hand-woven rugs were scattered across the polished wooden floors, and the late afternoon sun streamed through the huge windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It was silent, peaceful, and utterly hers. Her spirit felt alive in every corner. I settled into her favorite armchair, the one with the worn floral pattern, and finally turned my attention to the thick envelope Mr. Chen had given me. My name was written on the front in her elegant, looping script. With unsteady fingers, I broke the seal. Inside was not one letter, but a collection of them, bundled together with a faded silk ribbon. There were dozens, all written on her familiar cream-colored stationery. On top was a single, newer-looking page, dated just 6 months ago, the day she had finalized her will. I unfolded it and began to read. "My dearest Tracy," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone and you have come home. I am sorry, my darling girl, that I could not be there to welcome you myself, and I am sorrier still for the years of silence between us. Please know that not a day went by when I did not think of you and pray for your happiness. Your parents made it difficult. They saw my love for you as a defiance of their authority, and they used my own fear of being completely isolated against me. I was a coward, Tracy, and I hope one day you can forgive me for not fighting harder to stay in your life." Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the words on the page. I had spent so many years thinking she had forgotten me, or worse, that she had sided with my parents. To know that she had been inking of me all along was a balm to a wound I hadn't even realized was still so raw. "But I have watched you from afar," the letter continued. "I had an old friend in the city send me updates. I know about your graduation, your first job, the beautiful, independent life you have built for yourself. I am so incredibly proud of the woman you have become. You have my strength, but you also have a kindness your parents sadly lack. That is why I have left you everything. I know you understand that Whisperwind is not an asset, it is a legacy. It is a place of peace, and it needs a guardian, not an owner. You are the only one I could ever trust with it." She went on to explain the conservation easement, confirming what Mr. Chen had said. She had spent years working with lawyers to ensure the land would be protected forever. "Your father and mother will be furious," she wrote, with what I imagined was a wry smile. "They see land and only see dollar signs. They have never understood that its true value cannot be measured in money. They will likely challenge this will, which brings me to the other letters in this bundle." I looked at the thick stack of older letters tied with the ribbon. "These," she explained, "are the letters I wrote to you over the last 10 years, one for every birthday, every holiday. Letters your parents intercepted and returned to me unopened. They told me you were the one who refused them, that you wanted nothing to do with this family, myself included. For a long time, I believed them. But something never sat right with me, so I started keeping them, all of them, along with the original, postmarked envelopes showing they were returned to sender." My blood ran cold. My parents hadn't just cut me off. They had actively, cruelly deceived us both. They had made me believe my grandmother had abandoned me and made her believe I had rejected her. It was a level of malicious manipulation that was almost impossible to fathom. "These letters are your armor, Tracy," she wrote. "If your parents dare to contest this will on the grounds that we had no relationship, that I was not of sound mind to leave my estate to a granddaughter I barely knew, these letters will prove otherwise. They are proof of my sustained love for you and proof of their sustained interference. They document my thoughts, my feelings, my unwavering connection to you, even in silence. They are the truth. Use them if you must." I untied the ribbon and picked up the top letter. It was dated on my 20th birthday. In it, she told me how much she missed me and asked about my classes. Another, from a Christmas 5 years ago, described how she decorated the lodge and imagined me there with her, drinking hot cocoa by the fire. Each one was a dagger in my heart, a testament to the years of connection my parents had stolen from us. But they were also more than that. They were, as she'd said, my armor. They were irrefutable proof. The final paragraph of her last letter brought fresh tears to my eyes. Live a beautiful life here, my dear. Fill this old house with laughter and love. Let it be your sanctuary as it was always mine. And know that even though you cannot see me, I will always be with you here, in the whisper of the wind through the pines. All my love forever, Grandma Clara. I sat there for hours, reading through the stolen years, one letter at a time. The sun set, casting long shadows across the great room, and a profound sense of peace settled over me. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my chest, but it was now surrounded by a fierce, unshakable sense of purpose. My grandmother had not only given me a home and a future, she had given me a mission, to protect her legacy. And she had given me the perfect weapon to do it with. My parents had started a war a decade ago. Now, I finally had the ammunition to end it. The day after the will reading was a Saturday, and it began with a barrage of calls from a number I didn't recognize. I let the first few go to voicemail. When I finally listened, it was my mother's voice, tight with a strained, artificial sweetness. "Tracy, darling, it's your mother. I think we all got off on the wrong foot yesterday. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Your father and I just want to talk. We can be reasonable about this. Call me back." The second message was from my father, and it was all business. "Tracy, Harrison Vance. My lawyer has already begun the process of formally contesting the will on the grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. It's a long, ugly, and very expensive process. I suggest you call me before we all waste a lot of time and money. We can come to a private arrangement that is beneficial for everyone." Beneficial for them, he meant. They were trying the classic two-pronged attack, my mother with the fake olive branch, my father with the thinly veiled threat. They didn't know about the letters. They thought I was still that Isola. Ted, 19-year-old girl, they could easily intimidate. They were about to find out how much I had changed. My first call was not to them, but to David Chen. I met him at his office an hour later, the bundle of letters resting securely in my bag. I explained what my grandmother had told me in her final letter and showed him the proof, dozens of unopened, returned letters spanning a decade. As he examined them, his professional calm gave way to a look of quiet fury. He carefully inspected the postmarks, the return to sender stamps, and the pristine, unbroken seals. "This is beyond cruel," he said, shaking his head slowly. "And from a legal standpoint, it's incredibly powerful. Their entire case rests on the argument that your relationship with your grandmother was estranged and that her decision was therefore irrational. This," he said, tapping the stack of letters, "obliterates that argument. It proves a consistent, loving intent on her part and malicious interference on theirs. Frankly, if this were to become public, the damage to their reputation in this community would be immense." That was the key. My parents' entire existence was built on their reputation. Harrison, the savvy investor. Eleanor, the tastemaker with impeccable style. The image of the perfect, powerful couple. The idea of being exposed as deceitful, manipulative people who emotionally abused their own mother and daughter would be catastrophic for them. "So what's our plan?" I asked, feeling a surge of confidence. "Our plan," David said with a small, determined smile, "is to let them walk straight into the trap Clara set for them. Let them file their contest. Let them spend their money on legal fees. We will respond at the preliminary hearing. And we will win. Not through a long, drawn-out fight, but with a single, decisive blow." He laid out the strategy. We would not reveal our hand yet. We would let them make their official claims in court documents. Then, at the first hearing, we would present the letters. David was confident that upon seeing our evidence, any judge would dismiss their case immediately and might even reprimand them for filing a frivolous lawsuit. The public humiliation would be the real punishment. Leaving his office, I felt lighter than I had in years. The dread that had been my constant companion since returning to Northwood was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. For the rest of the weekend, I focused on the lodge. I walked every inch of the 200 acres, from the creek that babbled at the edge of the property to the high ridge that offered a breathtaking view of the valley. I breathed in the crisp mountain air and felt a sense of belonging I hadn't realized I was missing. I spent hours inside the lodge, reacquainting myself with its secrets. I ran my hands over the books in my grandmother's library, finding my old childhood favorites tucked away on a lower shelf. I found her recipe box in the kitchen, filled with handwritten cards stained with vanilla and butter. This place wasn't a house. It was a living, breathing archive of love. The thought of my parents turning it into a sterile hotel, stripping it of its soul for profit, solidified my determination. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about preservation. On Monday morning, I received a formal notice via email from my parents' lawyer, a shark from a big city firm. It officially stated their intent to contest the will. It was full of legal jargon, but the message was clear. They were accusing me of manipulating a vulnerable, elderly woman and claiming Clara was suffering from delusions when she wrote her will. The accusations were so vile, so far from the truth of the strong, sharp woman my grandmother had been, that my anger returned with a vengeance. But I followed David's advice. We filed a simple, formal response, denying the allegations and agreeing to the preliminary hearing date. And then we waited. The next 2 weeks were a strange limbo. I officially gave my notice at my job in the city, telling my boss I was taking over a family property. He was sad to see me go, but wished me all the best. I started the process of packing up my small apartment, a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. Most of my time, however, was spent at the lodge. I hired a local cleaning crew to help me deep clean the entire house, airing out rooms that had been closed for years. I started a small garden in the patch of sun near the kitchen, just as my grandmother had always done. I was putting down roots, literally and figuratively. My parents tried to contact me several more times. Eleanor left tearful voicemails talking about forgiveness and letting bygones be bygones. Harrison sent curt emails offering me a generous settlement, a lump sum of cash that was a fraction of the estate's value, in exchange for signing over the lodge to them. I ignored them all. There was nothing to say. The conversation would happen in a courtroom, just as they wanted, only it wouldn't be the conversation they were expecting. The hearing was set for a Friday, exactly 3 weeks after the will reading. I had my armor ready. I had my grandmother's truth on my side. All I had to do was wait for the moment to reveal it. The courtroom was small and formal, filled with the scent of old paper and floor polish. It felt a world away from the sun-drenched, pine-scented air of Whisperwind Lodge. I sat beside David Chen at one table, dressed in a simple, dark gray suit. Across the aisle, my parents sat with their high-priced lawyer. Harrison looked grim and powerful, his jaw set. Eleanor was playing the part of the grieving, wronged daughter-in-law, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. They both refused to look at me, instead directing their full attention to the judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes. This was a preliminary hearing, meant to determine if there was enough evidence for my parents' contest to proceed to a full trial. Their lawyer, a slick man named Marcus Thorne, stood to speak first. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and confident, "we are here today because of a grave injustice. The late Clara Vance, in the final months of her life, was suffering from a deteriorating mental state. Her final will, a drastic departure from all previous versions, is not a true reflection of her wishes. It is the product of undue influence from her estranged granddaughter, Tracy Vance." He pointed a dramatic finger in my direction. This young woman, after 10 years of complete and total estrangement from her entire family, including her grandmother, reappeared on the scene and manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman into disinheriting her only son, Mr. Harrison Vance. He went on for 10 minutes, painting a picture of me as a conniving opportunist and my grandmother as a confused, senile woman. He spoke of my unceremonious departure from the family, my refusal to communicate, and my sudden and suspicious return to favor. My parents nodded along, their faces masks of solemn agreement. Every word was a lie, and it took all of my self-control to sit there silently, my hands clenched into fists in my lap. David placed a calming hand on my arm, a silent signal to wait. Furthermore, Thorne continued, the will itself is evidence of Mrs. Vance's delusion. She has encumbered a $5 million property with a conservation easement, rendering it commercially useless. It is an irrational act that no person of sound mind would commit. We have testimony from Mr. and Mrs. Vance detailing the decade-long silence from the petitioner and their concerns about Clara's mental state. We believe there is more than sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. He sat down, looking immensely pleased with himself. The judge looked over at us. Mr. Chen, your response. David stood up calmly. In his hand, he held a single, unopened letter. Your Honor, Mr. Thorne has painted a very compelling work of fiction. I would now like to introduce a bit of fact. He approached the bench and placed the letter before the judge. This is a letter written by Clara Vance to her granddaughter, Tracy, on her 20th birthday. It is one of 67 such letters, written over the course of 10 years, for birthdays, holidays, and sometimes for no reason at all. Every single one of them, he said, turning to look directly at my parents, was returned to Mrs. Vance, unopened, from the address of Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Vance. A murmur went through the small public gallery. My parents' faces went rigid. Their lawyer, Thorne, looked confused, then alarmed. We have all 67 letters here, David said, gesturing to the box on our table, complete with the original, postmarked envelopes showing they were returned to sender. These letters prove two things. First, that far from being estranged, Clara Vance harbored a deep and consistent love for her granddaughter and made a continuous, documented effort to maintain a relationship. And second, his voice grew harder, they prove that Mr. and Mrs. Vance actively and maliciously interfered in that relationship, lying to both parties to create the very estrangement they now seek to profit from. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Their entire case is built on a foundation of lies, lies they themselves constructed. To claim undue influence is absurd. To claim estrangement is a demonstrable falsehood. The only manipulation that occurred here was perpetrated by Mr. and Mrs. Vance against their own mother and daughter. The judge picked up the letter, her expression unreadable as she examined the envelope. She then looked down at my parents, her gaze cold as ice. Mr. and Mrs. Vance, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Is this true? Did you intercept your mother's mail to your daughter? Harrison started to bluster. Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding. But Alina Br. Oak, all the poise and calculation vanished, replaced by pure, ugly spite. She was our mother, she spat, her voice shrill. That girl abandoned this family, she had no right. My husband was her son, it was his birthright. The outburst echoed in the stunned silence of the courtroom. Her mask had not just slipped, it had shattered completely, revealing the greedy, entitled core beneath. Thorne looked horrified, trying to quiet his client, but the damage was done. The judge slammed her gavel down once. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. That's enough, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. She looked at Marcus Thorne. Counselor, your case is predicated on a decade of estrangement. Mr. Chen has just provided compelling evidence that your clients manufactured that estrangement through deceit. Do you have anything at all, to refute this? Thorne, pale and sweating, could only stammer, No, Your Honor, we were not aware of this. The judge fixed my parents with a look of utter contempt. You come into this court and you slander the memory of your deceased mother, you defame your own daughter, and you build your case on a mountain of your own cruel deceptions. You are not entitled to a birthright. You are not entitled to anything. This entire contest is a bad faith, frivolous claim, and an abuse of the judicial process. She turned her attention back to the case file. The motion to contest the will is denied. With prejudice, she added, meaning they could never file it again. The will of Clara Vance, as written, is validated and will be executed in full. Then came the final sentence, the one that broke them. Furthermore, the judge said, her voice ringing with authority, I am ordering the plaintiffs, Mr. and Mrs. Vance, to pay all legal fees incurred by the defendant, Ms. Tracy Vance, in this matter. This court will not have its time wasted by such malicious and fraudulent claims. This hearing is adjourned." She slammed the gavel again. It was over. I looked over at my parents. They were frozen, their faces ashen. They had lost. Not only had they lost the lodge, but they had been publicly shamed, exposed, and were now on the hook for what I knew were tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees for both their own lawyer and for mine. Their smiles from the will reading were a distant memory. Now, their faces were etched with the pure, unadulterated shock of defeat. As I stood up to leave, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of peace. Justice, like my grandmother's love, had finally found its way home. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. The story of my parents' public humiliation in court spread through Northwood like wildfire. For a town built on appearances and old family names, it was a scandal of epic proportions. Their carefully curated image was shattered overnight. They were no longer the powerful Vance couple. They were the greedy, cruel son and daughter-in-law who tried to cheat their own daughter and dishonor a beloved matriarch. According to David, their social standing evaporated. Friends stopped returning their calls, and invitations to charity galas and country club events mysteriously dried up. They had built their world on a foundation of reputation, and now that foundation had crumbled to dust. A week after the hearing, a check for the full amount of David's legal fees arrived at his office, delivered by a courier. There was no note. A few weeks after that, the for sale sign went up in front of their sprawling mansion. They sold the house for a loss and moved away to a city a few states over where the Vance name meant nothing. I never heard from them again. There were no more angry voicemails, no more threatening emails, just silence. The silence I had once yearned for, and the silence they had once forced upon me, had finally become a mutual reality. With the legal battle behind me, I was free to fully embrace my new life. I finished packing up my city apartment, gave away most of my furniture, and moved into Whisperwind Lodge for good. The first few months were a period of healing and rediscovery. I explored every corner of the house and the land, feeling my grandmother's presence in the warmth of the sun on the porch and the sound of the wind in the trees. The lodge was a beautiful, solid structure, but it needed work. It needed life breathed back into it. My background as an architectural drafter, the very thing my parents had scorned, became my greatest asset. I didn't want to change the soul of the place, only to restore it and make it my own. I spent my days drawing up plans, not for a hotel, but for a careful, respectful restoration. I designed a new, modern kitchen that still fit the rustic aesthetic. I drafted plans to reinforce the grand porch, and to turn one of the unused guest wings into a beautiful library and drafting studio for myself. I hired local craftspeople, masons, carpenters, and electricians from Northwood. They were all people who had known and respected my grandmother, and they poured their hearts into the work, sharing stories about her as they repaired the stonework or refinished the floors. The lodge slowly came back to life, filled with the sounds of saws and hammers instead of silence. The conservation easement my grandmother had established was a gift not just to me, but to the entire community. I met with the Northwood Land Trust and worked with them to create a series of public walking trails on the outer edges of my property, ensuring that the people of the town could continue to enjoy the beauty of the mountain she had loved so much. I named the main trail the Clara's Way. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after I had moved in, I was sitting on the newly restored porch, a sketchbook in my lap, watching the leaves turn brilliant shades of red and gold. The restoration was nearly complete. My studio was filled with light, and the scent of baking bread, from a recipe I'd found in my grandmother's box, filled the kitchen. I had started doing freelance drafting work for architects in the region, building a new career on my own terms, from my own home. My life was quiet, but it was full. It was peaceful. I had found not just a home, but a purpose, to be the guardian of my grandmother's legacy, to cultivate the sanctuary she had entrusted to me. The anger and hurt from my past had faded, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. My parents had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, their greed had cost them everything. And my grandmother, with her wisdom and foresight, had given me more than I could ever have dreamed of. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the valley, I thought about the final line of her letter: "Live a beautiful life here." I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. I looked out at the majestic, silent mountains that stood guard over my home. "I will, Grandma," I whispered to the wind. "I promise I will." And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that I finally was.